Back to this. So today we'll carry on with our Azure Hangout series. So we initially started talking about subscriptions and resource groups and some of the foundational concepts around Azure. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to take in a little bit of step outside of what we've been discussing so far. And we're going to start talking about some of the Azure services. In this case, we're going to start by talking about Azure Storage. And this is not going to be like a typical, like, hey, let's just go through some slides. We're actually going to be taking our time to try to explain a few things, try to understand like some of the concepts behind this Azure storage service. So that's what we'll try to do. So the agenda for today is we'll start by talking about Azure storage account, an overview of that, talk about some security aspects to Azure storage. So, for example, if you don't want, because by default, if you create an Azure storage account, everyone's got access. And not, no, sorry, let me rephrase that. Not everyone's got access. It's available over the network, over the public internet. And if you don't lock that down to limit on to say only certain IP addresses can reach your Azure storage account, that means that it can be reachable from anyone across the internet. It's public DNS, it's got public IP addresses, and you see that. Not that you don't want it to be that case. So, for example, if you have a publicly hosted website, you want that to be the case, but just saying in certain cases how you can apply certain controls. So some other things I will talk about is things around encryption. Like when you talk about storage, you're talking about is it encrypted at rest? What about encryption in transit? And the good news is that by default, Azure storage is encrypted at rest. If you're creating it using the portal, it's encrypted by default in transit. So in other words, there's a particular option that you can enable. You can enable this option to say um, this Azure storage account can only be accessed using secure protocols. And that's referring to secure protocols like SMB version 3 if you're talking about Azure files, and HTTPS if you're talking about Azure Blob storage. So that setting is it's set to enabled by default. You can change it to disabled if you wanted to. If you're creating an Azure storage account using SDK, you may find out that that particular setting is disabled by default, in which case you need to explicitly enable that setting. We'll talk a little bit about Azure storage account monitoring and where some of the different metrics and logs can be found, or where you can get access to them. Talk about Azure CDN, Content Delivery Network, which helps to helps the user experience. Users that are accessing a different website, for example, there are certain content that they need to be able to access. How can we make that much more efficient for them? So that's kind of like the rough idea of what we'll try to cover here today. Um, so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pull up a few slides. We'll talk about a few slides, but I'll be using mainly the Azure, what's the name, the whiteboard today to explain some of the things that I'll be talking about. So let's get down to that. So let's go. Yeah, good, good. You can see my screen now. So this is just a bit of reminder. This is not 100% accurate because again, this number has changed. We're no longer, this is an old slide actually. But I just like it because it highlights what are the different categories to understand that there are multiple services when we talk about this thing called Azure. Azure is massive and it keeps growing every day. I mean, I was recently looking at a particular service called Azure Front Door that does content delivery, content acceleration. So, there's just new services popping up all the time on this huge platform called Microsoft Azure. And you can see that there are some services that are classified as infrastructure as a service. There's some services within Azure that are classified as platform as a service. In this case, our focus will be on this concept around Azure storage, which again, it's changed a lot. So that's what we'll be talking about today, Azure storage. Again, discard some of the information on this slide. Some of them are old. Azure Data Center region has gone way past 50 now, I believe, because there are new regions that were opened up in South Africa just recently. Okay, one thing that I want to start with when we talk about Azure storage is just to remind us of the scale that we're talking about. When we talk about Azure storage, there's massive scale. behind it. And one of the ways for you to know is that actually a lot of the services that we're looking at on the screen in Azure, they rely on Azure storage for what they do. So you have a look at it, have a look, we talk about CDN. When you're talking about Azure CDN, hey, what that's using in the back end is that it is using some form of Azure storage. When you're talking about Azure Compute, Azure IoT, all these services to an extent relies on Azure Blob Storage. And actually the scale of Azure Blob Storage is huge because if anybody has ever used Microsoft OneDrive is built as a service on top of Azure storage. And you know the scale of, you know, Microsoft OneDrive, where individual users can get terabytes of storage space that they could use to store different content that they're creating or that they're storing or they're archiving, whatever that may be the case. So it's a very massive platform, this Azure Blob Storage. It is a platform as a service in the sense that you are not managing any servers, you're not managing any compute. All you need to do is you go to a web interface, you specify the name of the storage accounts that you want to create, next, 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 you have a storage account created. So it is something that's very, very massive. So what I'll do is let's go to the Azure portal now. So what I'll do is I'll go bring up and log into Azure portal. There we go. So let's go portal.azure.com and I'll log in very quickly with my email address and password. I'll just drag this to the side a bit. Looks very good. We're in business. So let's go next. Yeah, it's all right. I like toggling this once in a while, but it doesn't now really matter. Okay, so what I'll do is I'm over here on the Azure portal, and what I'll do is I'll go to create a new resource. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and click on storage account to create a new storage account. So here we go. Of course, I've got to specify the subscription that the storage account is going to be associated with. I've got to specify a resource group. So I'll call this my storage resource group. Okay. So now I've got to specify my storage account name. And 1 minute. So if I go call this DO star 001. So one thing that you have to know with this name is it has to be unique. This name has to be unique across all of Azure because this is using a public namespace, which we'll see in a minute. So I go ahead and put on the name. And then the first question I get is I get information about the performance apart from the location. I have two options, standard or premium. When you talk about standard storage account, that's talking about the storage account is backed by magnetic disks. So your normal hard drive, that's what's behind that. When you talk about premium storage account, that's backed by SSDs. So that's very important. You have standard, you have premium performance tiers that you can select. If you select standard, magnetic disk is what's backing that. If you select premium, SSDs is what's backing it. One of the things to also know is that whatever performance tier that you select has an impact on the kind of storage accounts that you can use and the replication type that you can select. I know that I'm throwing a lot of times out. Just give me some moment. I'll get to the real explanation in a minute. So you can either have standard, you can have premium. If I select standard, for example, and if I go down, I can create a storage general purpose v2, storage general purpose v1, and blob storage. If I go ahead and select premium, I have different options. I can create a storage general purpose v2, storage general purpose v1, blob storage, and file storage, which is in preview. So the performance tier that I select specifies what type of storage account that I can use. So that takes me to the first question, or the first thing that we'll try to do today, which is this thing called Azure Storage Account. What is it? And what's the main information behind that? So let's go to quickly to a whiteboard. And what I'll do is I'll draw a board on the screen and I'll say this is my Azure Storage Account. An Azure Storage Account is a platform as a service type service, as I mentioned earlier. It's just a platform as a service type service. You're not managing any servers behind it, but it has multiple services underneath it. So when you create an Azure Blob Storage account, that's kind of like the mother account. It has many children under it. So I create an Azure Blob Storage. What are the different types of services that I can get with Azure, Azure Storage account? What are the different kinds of services that I can get with Azure Storage account? Number one thing is there's a service or a sub-service under Azure Storage account called the Blob Storage. And if you think about this, it makes sense because in the world, there are different kinds of data in the world, right? So for example, if you have a website, your website has pictures, has videos, that's a type of data. Your users, maybe they need to authenticate to be able to access your website. They need to put in their usernames and passwords, and usually that's stored somewhere. Hopefully, you're not storing your users' usernames and password in the some locations where you're storing videos for your website. Most likely, that information, that authentication information for your users, may be going into a database somewhere. That could be a SQL or NoSQL database. But that's a different type of data. So there are different types of data in the world, right? And we have different types of storage services to accommodate all those different kinds of data. So that's where all this comes from. Microsoft recognizing that to say, we're going to provide you with this thing called Azure Storage Account. And underneath that, you have multiple services that you can use to store the different kinds of data that you may want to be able to store. So for example, there's a service under Azure Blob, I keep saying Azure Blob, under Azure Storage Account, there's a service called Blob Storage. It's underneath Azure Storage Account. Blob, by the way, what blob means is binary large objects. Let's get some visibility over here. Let's go. So blob equals to binary large objects. So you have your blob, your B, your L, and your OB for blob. And what that means is, all it means is it for object-based storage. And object-based storage just simply means anything that's an object. Your files, it could be your videos, your audios, it could be a hard disk. They are all objects. So it's meant, so this blob service under the Azure Storage account is meant to store objects. Talk about some other types also. It's accessed typically over HTTP and HTTPS. Because that's very important. So if you want to access the contents that you're storing under the blob service, you're using HTTP or HTTPS. It could be via web browser. You could be making an API call, but that's typically how you access that. So here's why it gets interesting, because the blob service has multiple sub-services underneath it. So you have Azure Blob Service, yeah, that's fine. But then there are multiple sub-services under Azure Blob. So for example, there's a particular type of service called a page blob. So under the blob service, we have a page blob. we have another type of subservice under that called the block blob. And we have another type of service under that, still under the Azure Blob Service, called the Append Blob. So these are different sub-services under this Blob Service, which is under the storage account. So what does this mean? What is this thing called a page blob? What is it meant to do? So the thing with the page blob is this. Let's scroll up a bit. The page blob is optimized for random access. You go, okay. Again, IT people, we have like all these terms that we use. What does that mean, random access? Like optimize for random access. Give me something I can understand. Optimize for random access. So for example, if you have a virtual hard disk that a computer uses. So you have a computer, a virtual machine, and your computer has a virtual hard disk. Whenever you want to access the content of this hard disk, usually it's random access. You access the content randomly. A file that you want to access on this virtual hard disk may be stored in a different sector, right? Another file that you want to access the very next second may be stored in the opposite end. So in other words, this is not like a sequential access. This is something that's random access. You can access a particular content from over here on the hard drive. You can access another content from over on the other side of the hard drive. You're accessing this content randomly. So that's what Page Blob is optimized to do. It's optimized for random access. Therefore, if you want to store anything that has to do with virtual machine hard disks like VHDs, you're going to be storing that using the Azure Blob Service, using the Page Blob Service, because that's what it's optimized for. Let's take the other one very quickly. You have the block blob. What is that optimized for? The block blob is optimized for sequential access. Again, what does that mean? Give me something that I can relate to, David. Let's take, for example, you have music and video that you play. Usually, if you're playing like your video or your music, whatever, usually you're not starting like at second number 1 and then jumping to second number 50 and then jumping back to second number 1. You're not usually accessing these types of objects randomly. Usually you're accessing them in a sequential way. In other words, you start all the way from the beginning and you're playing it all the way to the end. When you're playing your music, you switch on the music, you play it from the very first second and you listen to it till it gets to the end. You might go back to repeat the music, but typically you don't start at second 1, then go to second 15, then go back to second 20, and then jump to second 50. You're accessing this sequentially. What that means is the block blob, if you want to store anything like your video objects and your audio objects that will be accessed sequentially, the block blob service is the right service for you. So I'll just put this over here. I'll drag block over there, not to impact on the others. And then finally, we have the append blob. Okay, what is append blob? What does it what is it optimized for? Because now you're getting the point is that these different services are optimized for different kinds of data and different kinds of the different types of data that we have. So append blob is optimized for append tasks. Okay, you're like, okay, David, you're just repeating yourself now. So I get the one for block, I get the one for page. What is it with this append blob that's optimized for append tasks? Give you an illustration. Take, for example, a log file. A log file. When you have a log file, typically you create the log file, and then what do you do after that? Typically, what you do is you want to add content to the end of the log file. So you keep adding content to the end of the log file. In other words, you're not creating new content, you're just adding content to your existing content. So it's kind of like an append blob is kind of like a block blob, but it's just a bit optimized for if you just want to add content to existing content. In which case, if you want to store things like log files, that would be great to store those using the append blob. So that's kind of like blob service by itself. But Azure storage account goes beyond just this type of data that we've described. For example, we talked earlier about maybe you want to store some user information that for users that are accessing your website, you need to store those. Where are you going to store those? Probably not in a blob service. There's another service under Azure Storage Account called the table service. Thing with the table service is think about it as kind of like a NoSQL database. So that's what it is. It's kind of like a NoSQL database. That's what the table service is created for. That's what it does. So, for example, so it's Microsoft's implementation of NoSQL database. Um, in terms of scale, they're like much more efficient database. But again, they've been really been doing a lot of improvement. So I won't like to talk too bad about that. But they've been doing a lot of improvement in terms of what this can handle. But you want some quick NoSQL type database where you can use to store certain JSON information in different formats like JSON. You can use Azure Table Service, which is under Azure Storage Account to store that. So that's what that's used for. Then we have other services under this. We have a service called Queue, which is this. What this is when you talk about the public cloud in some cases, so that as IT professionals, sometimes we talk about, yeah, the IT world is transforming. We have all our DevOps thing going on, we have containerization, we have all these, interesting concepts that, serverless and all these things going on. And we're like, man, this is disruptive to our industry, and then that's cool. But the same thing that's going on in our industry is also happening to our brothers and sisters over in the development world. The development world is also in a state of transformation, transforming from creating monolithic applications that it's just one single application as a whole, to create an application as microservices, which ties in very well with containers also. So in other words, rather than creating this huge application that everything has to scale together at once, you're breaking down different functions and different aspects of your organizations into little microservices. And if you start doing this, what that means is you have to get the different microservices or the different aspects of your application that now you've broken down. You have to be able to get the different aspects to communicate with one another, right? Because that's how they're going to be able to function together as a cohesive application, even though they are microservices. What that means is that you can change a little aspect of your application without impacting all the other aspects. Right? You get the advantage, but then they need to communicate with one another. They could make HTTP calls or API calls directly to one another. In some cases, you may not want to do that, which we won't get into all the details for that. In some cases, what you want to do is they can communicate using this thing called a queue. So function A wants to talk to function B in your application. It's going to put the information that it wants to pass across, it's going to put it in a queue. So that as function B constantly is working through the existing things that it needs to process. And when it gets to the end, it reaches out to the queue, it pulls in the new messages from function A and just carries on functioning. So that's what queue is good for. So queue can be good, it can be used for more than that, but it can be good for you want one application to be able to communicate with another application. You can implement the queue service, which is part of the Azure storage account. You can implement this queue service and get applications to be able to communicate with one another using the queue. And there's a lot of things that we are not even going to get into when it comes to this. But a lot of those in-depth information are covered in other courses with the Microsoft Azure courses itself. Okay, so that for queue. There's another service called file. Again, on the Azure storage account, another service called file. And this file service, similar to Blob in terms of It's object-based storage also. So file service, very, very similar to Blob. It's just object-based storage. So why do we need to have two, David? The main reason is that the place where file service differs is in how you access. That's where file service differs. Is how do you access this? Okay, how you access this is accessed using SMB. And for those of you that are familiar with this, you remember that SMB is the kind of protocol that we use when we want to access file shares. So you have a server on premises, like you remember the Windows days. Actually, there's no Windows days because we're still in the Windows days. But if you remember, like maybe your Windows Server 2012 days or something, you create this server, you call it a file server, then you create a file share, or sorry, a folder that you're going to share out on the network. And then if people want to access that folder over the network, they go to // server name / folder name, and then they access this folder over the network and they're able to access the content, and that becomes your network share. Essentially, what file service is under the Azure storage account, it's a network share without you having to manage the servers. You just go next, next, next. There we go. Here's a network share. I can access it using the same protocol that I use to access my normal network shares. So that's what the file service is. Accessed using SMB. So that's the main thing. Typically in the past, this is where I will have stopped, but there's a new service. So actually, let me go back to my portal, and if I go portal.azure.com, and what I'll do is I'll show you an existing storage account that I have. And let's go here, existing storage account, where you storage account. So let's go, there we go, storage account. I believe I should have at least one. Hey, look at that. I have multiple actually. So if I pick one of my storage accounts, you'll be able to see that here's my storage account. You'll be able to see the different services under the storage account. You can see the blob service here. You can see the file service here. You can see the table service. You can see the queue service. And typically, the one I'm about to mention, you notice that it's completely missing. It's like, oh, well, that's the end of it. So you go select another one and you have a look. You notice that that one also has its own blob service, it has its file service, it has stable service, it has its queue service. Yeah, so but that's where you see. And then if I go on the blob, for example, and I go to create a new blob, actually, no, I don't, there's no need for me to create a new container. I'll just use an existing container. And what I'll do is I'll try to upload an object into this container under the blob service. And one thing you'll find is, there you go, those are the different types of blobs that we have under the blob service. You have the block blob, you have the page blob, you have the append blob, and you can have those there. So if I were to be uploading a virtual hard drive, most likely I'll be selecting that. And you can see that there's an option that actually I can tick to say automatically when when you're uploading a VHD file or a virtual hard drive, upload them as page blobs, and that's recommended that you tick this option so that if you're trying to upload a virtual hard drive, it's going to automatically upload this to a page blob service. Then you have your block blob, and then you have your append blob also. So that's the place that you see those. But yeah, back to what I was talking about. There's a new one. There's a new service. It's not a completely new service. It's kind of like a service that's evolving. And this service is called the Azure Data Lake Generation 2 service. So, yeah, if there's a generation 2, obviously there ought to be a generation 1 somewhere. So, yeah, you're right, there is a generation 1. So, there is a generation 1 of Data Lake, which is essentially talking about big data and talking about big data analytics. And what happens is Data Lake Generation 1 is kind of like a standalone service by itself within the Azure platform, obviously. But what Microsoft are doing with Data Lake Generation 2 is that they are merging that with Azure Blob so that you get like the massive scale of Azure Blob with all the advanced analytics functions of Azure, of the Data Lake service also. So that's what this new service is about. And you can see this, for example, let me show this to you very quickly. If I go to create my storage account, right? And if I go here and I go, yeah, I want standard, I want general purpose version 2. I'm not going to create it, I just want to show you. If I go to next, you notice that I have an option here that says Data Lake Storage Gen 2 and it's disabled. If I enable this, that will enable this particular storage account for Data Lake Storage Gen 2 service. I will get to like where all the intricacies are that you need to understand. But hey, I think let's go ahead and just go back to what we've discussed so far here. Any questions at all? So let me have a look and see who is on the line. If anybody has any question, feel free. You can unmute yourself. Just ensure that the background noise is to a minimum and you can ask your questions before I move on to talk about other aspects. Adil, Vigna, you can unmute yourself. Please feel free to. Let's go to where is my chat window? You're good? You have no questions? Yeah. Any questions? You're good? Oh, okay, good. Okay. So let's move on then. Okay. So that gives you an overview of what the Azure Storage Account is. Now here's where it begins to get interesting. Actually, before I talk about that, let's talk about something very quickly. One of the things to talk about very quickly is all these different services that exist under the Azure Storage Account. They have their own URL endpoints that you can use to access them. The different services have their own URL endpoints that you can use when you access them. So what does that mean by they have their own URL endpoint? So for example, if I go to my storage account over here and I go to my existing storage account, let's close off this. If I go under the properties of this storage account, which should be over here somewhere, click on properties. So over here, I know that it's hidden and you cannot see that, but you can see there's a primary file service endpoint, primary queue service endpoint, primary table service endpoint, primary blob service endpoint. What I'll do is I'll copy the blob one and I'll go put that in the chat window over here, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. So what this looks like is this, is you have the endpoint for this is the storage account name .blob.core.windows.net. That's the endpoint to access the blob service of the storage account. If you need to access the table service, it's similar, only that you change blob here to table. And if you want to access the file service of the storage account, just change that to file, and that's how you access the file service. And if you want to access the queue service, same thing, only that you need to change that to queue. And there you go. And now you have your endpoint for the different services. So data lake is part of blob service, don't forget. So actually, in essence, it's not like really like this because you can either use one or the other. If you have data lake enabled, then that replaces blob. If you don't have data lake enabled, then what you get is blob. So this is like they replace one another. So if you enable this, you're instantly saying, I'm not going to be using the blob service and I'm just the blob service in this storage account. I want to be using data lake gen 2 with this. So that's what you're saying. So it's part of like the blob or blob service. So let's I'm thinking where to go with this. I don't want to bore you with details about architecture and all the other things. So because this is not the architecture course. So what I'll do is I'll just quickly talk a little bit about some information for you in the slides, and then we'll move on to the next topic for today. So let's go to my slide. Let's talk a bit about Azure Blob Storage. So let's talk about some pillars. We're not going to go into full details again. It's not an architecture course, but let's talk about, for example, durability and high availability of Azure Blob Storage. So Azure Blob Storage durability. Durability means how a service can endure wear and tear. So durability is, for example, some of you may have leather belt that you've used for like 5 years and it's still strong, right? It's still not broken. It's gone through all kinds of things. It's been in the rain, it's been in the sun, it's been in the sun, it's been everywhere, but that leather belt is still standing. So that's talking about how durable Azure Blob Storage is. And the durability depends, it really based on what's built behind it. So number one is that it has strong consistency. In other words, when let's go back to talk about this consistency bit. If you say I want to store a file, let's go. This is file one on this storage account in the blob service, in the blob service, for example. It's not only going to just take the service and just going to store it and just go once. What it's actually going to be doing is it's going to be taking this file and it's going to be storing this file in 3 different places within the data center that you're using in Azure, depending on what option that you've selected with the replication. So it's not just going to be like, I'm just going to be storing one, and then what happens is that particular storage system fails on Azure, and that's it, you've lost your file. So by default, Azure storage account is never without redundancy. There's no way to have Azure storage account without redundancy. What you can do is you can choose to select a higher level of redundancy beyond the basic one. So for example, if I go back over here, when I'm creating my storage account, you'll notice if I go back to the previous section, I can select replication, but I cannot disable replication. The least I can do is go locally redundant storage, in which case it's going to store 3 copies of my data within the region that I'm in. So that's what locally redundant storage means. Sorry, within the data center that I'm using. So that's locally redundant storage. Zone redundant storage, on the other hand, so in the concept of Azure architecture, you have your regions, and within your region, you have your data centers, which are also called zones, or collection of data centers called zones. So if you want to be able to if you want to spread your data rather than storing those copies within a single data center, you want to spread across different data centers within the same region, then you can select zone redundant storage. If you want to have some copies of your data spread to another region within your geography. So for example, if you're storing anything in West Europe, you have a paired region called North Europe. So they are within the same geography. If you're storing anything in UK West, you have the UK South, where that's like the pairing. And if you select geo redundant storage, what that means is I'm going to store 3 copies of your data within your current region, and I'm going to go store 3 copies of your data within the paired region. So let's say I'm using West Europe now, and I select GRS. 3 copies of my data will be stored in West Europe. The other 3 copies will be stored in the paired region for West Europe, which is North Europe. And you can refer to this document just called Azure Region Pairing. And it's going to give you the document and explain what the different paired regions are, so that you know that when you select GRS, you know where the other 3 copies of your data will be stored. So if you're storing anything in Canada Central, your other 3 copies will be in Canada East, because that's the pairing of the data centers. That's the way that they are paired with one another. And you can see UK West is UK South. What about Europe? Not Europe, it's West Europe. So anything that you just point there, 3 copies is over there. The other thing to note is that if I go here, so you can specify, you can disable redundancy, you can specify the level. When you're using this option, it's going to be doing synchronous replication. Synchronous replication means before I send the response to say operation completed, I'm going to make sure that I've stored the 3 copies very well and the 3 copies are safe before I send you a response and say everything is good. If you're using locally or zone redundant storage, that's synchronous replication. In other words, it's going to store the 3 copies and make sure everything is good before it sends you a response. If you're using geo-redundant storage, because now you're talking about data traveling across, something that could be over 300 miles. You cannot go beyond the speed of light for now, at least. Right? Or physicists may disagree. So you cannot go. You don't go beyond the speed of light. So what that means is that it can do synchronous. Otherwise, there's going to be a delay. So what's going to do is it's going to store 3 copies in your current region, in your current location, synchronously, and then it's going to do an asynchronous replication to the paired region in the background, and just do that. So that it's not going to become a delay for you. So that's what geo-redundant storage is. And of course, you have the final one, which is read access geo-redundant storage. Because this geo-redundant storage, yeah, it's going to be replicating your data to that, but you can't really access that data. It's for Microsoft. Let's say something were to happen and the whole West Europe region goes down. Microsoft will activate your data for you in North Europe if you've selected this. But in some cases, you want, okay, I know my data exists there, but I also want to be able to access it sometimes. So in that case, you can select read access, which is still geo-redundant storage, 3 copies in your current region, 3 copies asynchronously replicated to the paired region, but I'm going to give you read access to that. And you can connect to it and view that. So that's what that is about. I think I'll stop talking about Azure Blob Storage. I think we've been talking for a while. What we'll do is let's take a quick 5 or let's take a 10 minutes break. Time is 7:16 my time here. Let's come back 7:26. I guess the fact that I've not eaten since morning is kicking in. So let's come back 7:26, and when we come back, what I'll do is I'll just give you some more information about Azure Blob Storage, and then I'll talk about Azure CDN. So you do not want to miss this. So see you in 10 minutes. Okay. So just we gave a brief description of Azure Storage Account before I went on a short break, and talked about the different services that it has under it. And I hope that that makes a bit more sense to you in terms of the services under the storage account, in terms of the replication, excuse me, what the different services are optimized for, and in terms of like the different replication models. So there's a few other things that we didn't really talk too much about. So I'll just try to cover a few of that. So you see there's a account kind over here. So here's what you need to know about this. Whatever you select in these 2 steps on the performance and on the account kind has an impact on which service that you can use. Whatever you select under the performance and under the account kind impacts what service you can use. What does that mean? Let's try to break that down a bit. So here's the breakdown of that. For example, let's say when you are creating your storage account in Azure, you decided, let's go to the whiteboard, and let's get a bigger whiteboard. Look at that, got a bigger whiteboard now. So what I'll do is I'll drag this to the side, and let's say you determine when you were creating your Azure storage account that you're gonna select standard storage, for example. So for the performance tier, so that's in this place you decide. Let's get rid of this. You decide I'm gonna select standard. Okay. And then you decide I'm going to select general purpose version 2 over here. That has an impact on which of the services that you can use. What service can you use if you select a combination of these 2? Well, let's go back to our whiteboard and let's go see. So standard is what you've selected, and you selected general purpose v2. So let's go back over here. So we have a self-standard, and we also have, so let's move this. That's better. Standard, and I'm selecting general purpose v2. If you select this, here are the services that you'll be able to use. You'll be able to use the blob service, which will include both the page and sorry, which will include the page, the block, and the append blobs. You'll be able to use the table service, the queue service, the file service. You won't have data lake gen 2, which is what you see with some of the services that I've selected when I showed those to you that I showed you some of the existing services that and some of the existing storage accounts that I've created. So let's go back under here. And I'll drag this over here. And if I go on this existing storage account, you notice I have the blob service, I have the file service, I have the table service, I have the queue service. What type of storage am I using with this one? I'm using general purpose V1. So maybe if I have one that I have general purpose V2. They are general purpose V1, that's fine. So, but you get the point. That's what you can use. If that's what you select, that's what you can use. What if you decide, and I'll just copy and paste this to make it much easier. What if you decide I'm still going to select standard, but this time around, I'm going to select general purpose V2, but you're not going to make a slight change. General purpose V2 with data lake gen 2 enabled. So you're still going to select general purpose V2, and I'll show you that in the screen over here. But what happens is when you go to the next step, you choose to enable data lake storage gen 2. If you choose to do this, this is what you have. The normal typical blob that you used to use, that's gone. And what you have is you have this in place of the blob. Of course, it's working with the blob. It has both the characteristics of data lake and Azure blob. But this is what you have. You'll be able to use data lake service, table, queue, and file service. That's what you get. So does that make sense to you in terms of whatever you select in terms of the performance tier, in terms of standard or premium, and whatever you select in terms of the type, whether it's general purpose V2, whether it's general purpose V2 with data lake Gen 2 enabled, whether it's other options that's going to affect the service that you can use within the storage account. So let's go. What other option do we have? What about you choose, in this case, general purpose V1? What options do you have? So rather than you selecting general purpose V2 here, get rid of that. You can be selecting general purpose V1. In this case, what you're going to have is similar to general purpose V2. You're going to have blob, table, queue, and file services. That's what you're going to have. But here's the thing is that there's no option to select general purpose V1 with data lake gen 2 enabled. So that option does not exist. So general purpose V1, as ancient, it's not, well, not ancient, does not have some of the new services that Microsoft are creating. The new improvement and services, you may not see them in general purpose V1. So if I go back to previous, if I go ahead and select general purpose V1 here, and then if I go to next, so let's go back, previous, maybe did I make a mistake? Oh, no, oh, no, that's interesting, I didn't know that. You learn something new every day. So actually, if I go West Europe, standard, general purpose V1, except something is misbehaving. Oh, here we go. It just took a while. So if you select general purpose V1, right, you notice that I cannot enable data lake Gen 2 because it's not an option that's available for Gen 2. For you to use this, you have to be using general purpose V2. So on and on. I don't want to go into like all the combinations. So actually what I'll just do is I'll bring up another document that I created over here, and I'll just show to you what those options are very quickly. I won't run through them. So you can see here, if I select standard storage account, if I select general purpose V1, that's what I'll get. Standard storage account, if I select blob, I only get blob. So what that means, let me show this one to you because it's interesting. If I go back to previous, if I select standard, but I select blob storage here. What that means with what I've just selected is I'll only be able to use block blob and append blobs. So just be aware of that. So the main one of the main differences with this is when Microsoft first started, they had general purpose V1 and they had blob storage. And they had blob storage account type. Blob storage account type defines it supported um, different tiers. So where you could have hot, where you could have cool, and I'll explain that in a minute. But what happened is when they released general purpose V2, they kind of combined the characteristics of general purpose V1, which is you have all the services, with the characteristics of blob, which is you have the hot and the cool tier. So then that's what general purpose V2 is. It has the characteristics of both blob and general purpose V1, which is why recommendation is, if you can, to use this one. So if I go back to what I was showing you earlier, if I go ahead and select blob here, you notice I can select access tier to be cool or to be hot. If I select general purpose V1, you notice that that option does not exist. But if I select general purpose V2, you notice that I have this. Well, what they've done, so general purpose V2 is a combination of the characteristics of this and the characteristics of this together. So now you can select this and get all the services, but at the same time, you have the access tier. So that takes me into conversation about the access tier. What is this access tier thing? What does it mean? So in Azure storage account, there are multiple things that you're charged for. And again, in the architecture course, there's much more details when it comes to that. In this particular course, we don't go into too much details in terms of, architecture and all of that. It's, just general understanding. Okay, so what happens? The main things that you pay for in an Azure storage account. Two of the main things that you need to know that you pay for. You pay for the amount of data that you're storing. Okay, I want to store a 10 gigabyte size of data or whatever in this blob storage or whatever. You're going to pay for that. As you start storing it, Microsoft is going to charge you per gigabyte for what you're storing in the Azure storage account. Whichever service that you're using, you're going to be paying for the size of what you're storing. And next month, you decide you're going to add 20 more gig, you're going to be charged for what you're storing. But you're also going to be charged for accessing the data. So as you access the data, you're reading the data, you're writing the data, there's some minute charges, but you're still going to be charged for that. So what Microsoft decided to do was to give people flexibility, because there's some data that you don't need to access like all the time, and they felt that it was kind of like unfair to penalize you where you're paying for this even though you don't access it all the time. So what happens is, if you select hot storage, the amount that you're going to be charged for accessing the data will be lower, but the amount that you're going to be charged for storing the data will be a bit higher. If you select cool, on the other hand, the amount that you're going to be charged for storing the data will be a bit higher. Sorry, will be lower. Sorry, apologies. If you select cool, the amount that you're going to be charged for storing the data will be lower. But if you want to access the data, then you're going to be charged more to access the data. So that's kind of like the difference between the two in terms of hot and cool. And one thing that I just need to warn you about, that you need to be very careful. If, let's say, you create a storage account and you say, oh, I'm going to have it as cool. And then later you go back and say, I want to change this to hot. Think about what you're doing before you do that. Think about it very, very carefully. Because here's what's going to happen. By selecting from cool to hot, it's going to read all the data, which means you're going to be charged for that, for reading all the data. And of course, it's going to write all the data on hot. And then you're going to be charged for that also. So you're going to be incurring the charges when you start jumping around between this one and this one. So just think about it much more carefully, when before you start deciding you're going to start moving around from one to another one. It's something to really think about. Okay, let's go. Let's go. So there's a few things that I want to do here, and then we'll pick up again. Any questions at all regarding what we've just explained? We've just gone through some basic configuration of storage account. Any questions before I move ahead and talk about Azure CDN, and then we'll call it a day today? So let's bring up a whiteboard. Let's talk about Azure CDN. And I want to do a demo for you for Azure CDN. So hopefully, I'm just checking out my demo environment now. Uh, okay, maybe I can just use that to show you the deployment. Okay, so yeah, I want to start it. Can you start it, please? So my web app is running, but is my web app available? Can I access my web app? No, it keeps saying site under construction. Okay, let's see if I can fix that. So let's talk about Azure CDN and then I'll see if I can fix my demo environment while we're doing that. So Azure CDN Content Delivery Network. What is this service? Why does it exist? Is where we'll start from. Let's get some context to this service first of all. In the modern world, of course, if you have any type of web application, your users expect fast web experiences. They don't expect to go to a website and then it's taking ages to download anything. They don't expect that. They want to be able to get to a service and access it, to a web service and access it very fast. That could be on their mobile phone, that could be on their laptops, on their desktop, wherever. I'm not a statistician or somebody that studies like websites and stuff like that, but I'm sure that there are statistics that show that the slower a web application is, the more bounce that you're going to get from it. In other words, the more people are not going to want to visit your site because it's taking time to load. And here's the thing, when you're talking about the load time of a website, so let's say I have a web server hosted here on Azure, for example. That could be in form of infrastructure as a service. Maybe I have a VM that's running Apache and my website is hosted on that. Or maybe I'm using platform as a service in terms of using an Azure App Service. This is infrastructure as a service. Right, this is platform as a service. Whatever option that I'm using when I'm hosting my service, I have my web content hosted on this. Maybe I've got videos and audio files and all the other likes that I'm storing. Um, maybe some of them I'm storing in an Azure storage account in the backend. Maybe using Azure Files or using Azure Blob, whatever form that I'm using. If my user that's accessing my service over here needs to access this service, they need to be able to load the content of my site, which is over here either on my web server or in an Azure storage account here. Let's say my user were to be located in Hong Kong and my server over here is located in West Europe. There's going to be delays in terms of the user being able to load my site and load all the content from here. That's just normal, right? There is a limitation in terms, there's a limitation in terms of the speed of light. Cannot travel faster than the speed of light. Laser that we use, like for the fiber that we use, can only travel so fast. So even though it's like really, really fast, you look at some of like the page load times across the ocean, it's fast, but still there's still going to be delays. So what CDN allows us to do is to move the static content. That's very important to emphasize that. The static content of our web app or our web server, being able to move the static content closer to the user. Move it as close to the user as possible. So let's say this takes about 200 milliseconds to load. Hopefully when I move this very close to the user, maybe that's going to take 20 milliseconds to load. And that's the whole point with CDN. CDN, the whole reason why CDN exists is to improve user experience. And the way CDN improves user experience is it moves the content, the static content of your web applications, it moves those static content closer to the user. So this is not something that's new, it's something that always existed. the main thing that Azure has added to this conversation about CDN, because CDN has always existed, is it's made it simple. It made it available. So typically in the past, if I wanted to use CDN as an organization, I'll need to have a fat bank account. Then I'll need to go to one of the CDN providers, be it Akamai or Verizon, or any other. Akamai is a really really popular one. Go to like my content delivery network provider and sign a contract with them, and then we sign all these contracts, and then we'll set up all this my domain name and all that stuff, and finally, oh yeah, I've got CDN done. You can literally set up CDN in Azure in less than 5 minutes. Right? It's no longer like this long drawn out process, right? It's now just a commodity like everything else. And there are three CDN options on Microsoft Azure. You can either choose to use Microsoft's own CDN. So Microsoft have their own network of point of presence around the world that they can use to host your static content so that your users can access them very quickly. They have this one managed by Microsoft spread around the world. So you could choose to use that. You could use Akamai. So the big boys are still there. You could choose to use Akamai CDN. And it's the same experience if you wanted to set up using Microsoft CDN. It's the same experience to set up the Akamai CDN. It's just on the same page. You can do that. Or you can use the one by Verizon. And if you wanted to have a look and see where these CDN options are, where the different edge servers are located, you can go have a look on this document by Microsoft that I highlight. Hey, here's Microsoft CDN, here's the region, here are the different areas that we have our point of presence in this region. Is the Verizon CDN is our region, the North American region, and here are the places where we have a point of presence. Don't think that Akamai has very little. The thing is they are not sharing that information. So they may have more, but the thing is they're not sharing that information. So it says pop city locations for Azure CDN and Akamai are not individually disclosed, but they have multiple in US, multiple in Mexico, multiple in Canada, but they're just not disclosing it here. So the same thing, you have a look here and you see South America, you see all the different areas and cities and countries where they have their different points of presence for the Microsoft one. So essentially you can make an informed decision of which of the CDNs that you want to use. So that's the whole idea of the CDN. So let's give some terms to you when it comes to understanding CDN. So where the original content is stored, it could be on a web server, it could be an Azure storage account, it could be a platform as a service, it could even be a web server on premises. As long as it's reachable, that's fine. As long as it's reachable, when you configure your CDN profile, you can specify the URL to go, and as long as that's reachable, CDN is good. It can cover that. But where the original content comes from is referred to in CDN terms as the origin. So you hear this term about, oh, the origin, the origin, the origin. So the origin is where the original content comes from. Where the content is moved to or stored, it's called the edge server. And that's usually in a point of presence location by the CDN providers, any of these three. And the experience is this. The first time a user in Hong Kong tries to access my content, they're going to be directed to the CDN. If the CDN does not have that content, if it's a video, an audio, whatever, the CDN will request that content from the origin. Say, hello origin, can I get this content? Origin sends the content to the CDN, and then the CDN is going to cache that content over on its own side. And then from then on, any new users from Hong Kong that tries to request the same content, again, they get sent to the CDN, which case they're just going to grab the content and just display it. Boom. They don't need to go through that process again. So it's only going to be requested the first time that that edge server requests it. But once it's been requested and once it's cached on that edge server, that's it. There's no need to request again. It's going to keep it there and it's going to keep it there. So what I'm going to try to do, and because my test environment is messing up a bit here, so what I'm going to try to do is, let's go restart the shell. And if I refresh my web, so my web is messing up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try very, very quickly to build a platform as a service website over here. So I'll try to make it as very quick as possible. I'm going to be using command line. I'm not going to be explaining stuff. So apologies for that. I just want to show you a demo of what that looks like so you can relate to it a bit more. So hopefully once this is done, yeah, let me quickly go build a platform as a service site. Okay, so what I'm doing there is I'm just creating a directory and going to that directory. Then the other thing that I'm going to be doing is I'm going to cloning this code from this GitHub. So this is just a, if you go to that link, you can go download. So I'm just cloning that GitHub project. Oh, okay, because I already have it. That's fine. So what I'll do then is I'll browse to that location where I have my um, where I have my project downloaded. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create a new web app. I'll call this web app 3. So AZ web app up, location east US, and web app 3. And if I go ahead and press enter to that, so what that should do is it should create a default resource group and create a platform, an app service plan, and then create my app service and then deploy the code that from this GitHub clone, deploy the code into that. So I'll be able to access that on my website. So that should not take the long time. So let's just see what that looks like if that fails or if that succeeds. If it fails, then I guess I'll need to do the demo to you next time. But that's the joy of live demos, right? While we're waiting for this to happen, oh, here we go. That's very good. So that looks successful, and that's the web app 3. So what I'll do is I'll go to my Azure App Services page, refresh. I have the web app 3 over here, and I'll go to the URL and see if I can access it. Here we go. Fine, excellent. So now you can see you've got my website with 2 images on that. So this image content is stored somewhere. So and what I'll do is I'll show you like the whole concept about CDN using this. So what I'll first of all do is I have this website. I'll go create a CDN profile for this particular website. So if I go under Azure, if I go under create a resource, actually there are 2 ways I can do it. I can go to create a resource, I can go CDN, and I can do it using this way. Or another way I could do is because I'm using an Azure App Service, is I can go under my app service, go under my app service, which is DO Web App 03. If I go under networking, I have this option here that says configure Azure CDN for your web app. So if I click that option, it's going to take me to the same location as where I create a new CDN profile. So it's taking me here. It says, hey, create a new CDN profile. What do you want to call this CDN profile? So I'll just call it a few names. I'll call it DOCDN profile 03. You can see this is what I'm talking about. You can select Microsoft, Verizon, Akamai, or Premium Verizon. So that's the options that we have that we can choose to select any of the options. So one of the main difference between the Premium Verizon and the standard Verizon is it has more analytics reporting that you can get from this one than from the other one. There are some other features that exist here that don't exist here also. So for now, I'll just select standard Akamai. Some of you may be thinking, why are you selecting Akamai, David? Why not select Microsoft? The main reason is because of the replication period or the propagation period. So propagation period for standard Microsoft is about 10 minutes. We don't have 10 minutes left. We have about 6 minutes left in this in this particular Hangout. So Akamai takes 1 minute in terms of propagation. So that's why I'm going to select standard Akamai. So CDN endpoint name that I need to put in. So let's go put in an endpoint name of, let's keep it simple. So that's what my CDN endpoint will be called. So my developers, as they are putting their content, that's what they'll be pointing to. And that's where the origin is where I need to specify here. That's why I can use, even if a web server is hosted on premises, as long as it's externally available, I could point to that. But this is coming from my Azure App Service, so that's already filled in for me. So when I go ahead and click create, and it's going to go ahead and create the CDN profile for me with an endpoint that's pointing to that origin over there. And what happens is that I'm going to make a note of this endpoint name, that endpoint.azureedge.net. So let me make a note of that because that's going to be important to the next thing I want to show you. So that's docdn endpoint 03.azureedge.net. So let's wait for that to finish creating. So by the way, I think I'll need to be able to see when it's finished creating. Oh, here we go. It's finished creating and it's running. So very good. So what I'll do is that's my app service that I'm accessing, right? I'm accessing my app service. So what I'll do is if I go over here and if I go to my CDN endpoint directly, and if I go to try to access that, you can see that I'm accessing my site. So what is done is the first time I requested that, I'm just using this to show you a demo. First time I requested that, it's gone to the origin and collected that, and it's cached this information over here. So that's good. So let me go back to my, um, okay, so, oh, I've lost it. No, I've not lost it. I've lost that session. So let me go ahead and restart that session because what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change to my website and I'm going to see if that's going to propagate. So let's go quickly. 3 more minutes before Hangout ends. So I'll go over here very quickly and I'm going to make a change. So I'm going to make a change. I'm going to change this body. I'm going to change this from Azure App Service 1. I'm going to change this to Azure App Service version 2. And I'm going to use Control plus O to save it and press Enter to write it and Control plus X to exit. So I've just made a change to my web app, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit those changes to my web app. So let's go ahead and run that again. So hopefully that's just going to update the change that I made. And once that's committed, yeah, so what I'll do is I'll go to my web app now. I'm not going to the CDN, I'm going straight to my web app. If I refresh that, you can see that that's changed to Azure App Service v2. If I go back to my CDN and I refresh that, you notice that it still keeps giving me this because again, it's going to be quicker now because now I'm just grabbing the content straight from my CDN and just pulling it in. But all the new changes that I've made, it's not there. Of course, if you wanted to, we could go ahead and purge the CDN so that we get the new content. So I could go on the Azure CDN over here. And if I go on the House Services and I type in CDN and I go on the CDN profiles, and if I select my profile, and then I need to select my endpoint, which is this. And what I could do at that point is I could purge it. So if I wanted to, I could say I don't want to purge every content. You've got to be careful if you have like a massive website and stuff. Like imagine Microsoft goes to purge, the entire Microsoft.com. So you may want to be more specific and say, okay, I only want to purge index.html. So the same parts that it's using on your origin is what it's going to be using over here. And I'm going to say, hey, purge that. And once that's successfully purged, then I can go back and I can go to my CDN and I should be able to get like the updates that I made. And there you go. I got the update that I've made. Okay. So that brings us perfectly to the end of this particular Hangout. Thanks very much for joining me. Next week, I am on holiday. I'm on leave. So I don't believe that I will have an Hangout on Wednesday or Thursday. But what I will plan to do is most likely I may plan a hangout for Sunday next week because I want us to be, um, to keep it consistently. Let's move on. Let's get moving. Let's get through this so that we can go to Azure architecture and do that course also. So thanks very much. Any questions that anybody have, feel free to ask the question. But at this time, I can go ahead and no, let's see. Do you have a question? No, no problems, Adil. It's a pleasure. Thanks very much for joining. If nobody has any question, that's it for today. Thanks very much for joining this Hangout, and I'll see you next Sunday, hopefully, for the next Hangout. So see you later. Bye.